Good.
All right. We'll get started. So.
Oh, I left.
A little more to the letter, right? Okay. We'll cut that part out.
There you go. There you
Perfect.
go.
Okay. We'll start recording here. Before beginning, we would like to respectfully acknowledge the land of Newfoundland as the ancestral homelands of the Nipmuc and Beothuk. We also recognize the Inuit of Nunatsiavut and Inuktitut, and the Inuit of Nitassinan and their ancestors as the original people of Labrador. We strive for respectful and equitable partnerships with all people of this province as we work towards true reconciliation and honor this beautiful land together. Today, I think is our last in-person seminar of the semester. And today we have Yolanda Wiersma to give our seminar. So Yolanda received a PhD from Guelph and Duke University. And she's now an assistant professor here at MUN. Sorry, associate professor.
Nope.
Sorry. My bad, not assistant. Here at MUN, where she works in landscape ecology in the Boreal region. She has quite a few projects on the go here in the province, and has also dabbled in projects investigating information quality and citizen science. So today she will be unpacking some of the elegant, creative, and robust natural and manipulative experiments possible in landscape ecology. So, welcome, Yolanda.
Thanks very much. All right, I'm just going to minimize the Zoom here so to make that clear away. All right, I think I'm just going to, based on where you were standing, I'm going to put that. Okay. All right. Well, thanks everyone for coming. Are you bothered if I take my mask off?
Nope, you're welcome to.
I find it hard to. It gets very hot. Okay. To the folks on Zoom, I'm going to try to remember to look at you, and I hope we're positioned okay. The sun is kind of screaming in here, so there might be some silhouette effects going, but thanks to those who came in person as well. So when I got asked to do the seminar this semester, I had to stop and think, well, what have I been working on? I've had a really nice group of grad students that's been really productive, but they've all sort of presented their work, and I thought, well, what's been new lately? That's kind of been my work. And really the only thing was the last couple of years, those of you who know me, know I've been working on a book on experimental landscape ecology. So I made that the title of my talk, but really we could, Windows thing. We could call this a shameless self-promotion of my upcoming book, which just is in the early stages of production, should be out, touch wood, in 2022, well behind schedule as is typical. That sounds somewhat self-serving, so I like to think of this as the Cold Notes version of my book. And therefore, attending this talk is worth a couple $100 to you because you won't have to buy the book now after you. So what I'd like to cover is a quick primer on landscape ecology. That's not really covered in the book because the book is written for landscape ecologists. And then the rest of the talk more or less follows the flow of the book. I'm going to talk about broadly what are experiments, what do we mean, what does it mean to do experiments, particularly in ecology? What are some of the challenges to doing landscape experiments or experiments in the landscape? Really short section on the taxonomy of experiment types. And then the bulk of the talk and the bulk of the book is about experimental approaches. So just for those of you who are not landscape ecologists or haven't taken a landscape ecology course, just a quick primer of sort of what the field is. So first thing I get asked a lot is, well, what is a landscape? How do you define a landscape? The shorthand definition that we like to use in landscape ecology is it's what you can see from an airplane window. Now, for most of us, it's probably been a while since we rode on a plane. But if you think about the last time you had a window seat on a daytime flight going over across the continent, and you look down, what do you see? You see the topography. You can tell if you're flying over something that's bumpy or flat. You can see the land cover types, and you can see the human land uses. You can see towns, you can see roads, you can see clear cuts. You can't see individual trees, you can't identify individual species, but you can tell if you're going over a forest, and if you have a good eye, you can even tell if it's deciduous or coniferous. And those things integrated together, the land forms, the land cover, and the land uses are what we sort of collectively think of as a landscape in landscape ecology. And we're interested in how those things interrelate and how spatial pattern of those things influences ecological processes and vice versa. So landscape ecology is one of the newer subdisciplines of ecology. It dates back to the early 70s as a formal sort of identified subdiscipline with its roots in Europe, mainly in the Netherlands. But it sort of gained momentum really starting in the 1950s, taking advantage of aerial photography technology that was developed for World War II. And the journal, Landscape Ecology, which is kind of the flagship journal of the discipline, got its start in 1987. And this is just a chart showing you the growth of the journal up to the latest data is 2016. So you can see, steady growth in number of articles and also number of submissions. And so the discipline is sort of approaching 40, 30 years old, depending on sort of whether you're looking Europe or North America. And that to me says it's right for some thinking about, what is the discipline about? What are we doing? And one of the things, if you look, the article that goes with this graph is kind of a retrospective article. And one of the critiques this article makes is that we don't do very many experiments in landscape ecology. So what are experiments? What do we think of when we think of experiments? If you ask sort of a layperson, especially I find, given that I live with a couple of boys, well, they're not that young anymore, but certainly when they were young, or just even members of public, if you ask them to think about an experiment, they sometimes think of an image like this. Or they think of something like this, or this is how experiments are often shown in the media. I don't know why always they have some bluish tinge to them. Why is that? I don't know. But anyway, this is kind of the image that the public has, or that the lay people have, of what experiments are. And if you say, well, I'm an ecologist and I do experiments in ecology, then these are the kind of images that people tend to think of. Measuring things, quadrats, stakes in the ground, flagging tape, and people dressed like this is sort of what we think about. But experiments are much more than that. They're much more than the tools we use. They're much more than the venues we work in. And if you're interested in unpacking that a little bit further, this is a book I highly recommend. It's available as an ebook from the QE2. It's called Landscapes and Labscapes, and it explores the lab field border in biology. It's a really interesting read. It's written by a historian, but it's just a nice sort of relaxing read, and I got a lot out of it. But the main purpose of doing experiments is, of course, to test hypotheses. But it turns out in ecology broadly, not just landscape ecology, we're pretty poor at that. This is a brand new paper that just came out in Ecology and Evolution by Matt Betts and colleagues, and it evaluates the use of hypotheses in ecology and evolution. Excellent paper. We just read it in my lab group a couple of weeks ago. And they talk about sort of the philosophy of science broadly, and then they go and they mine papers going fair ways back in time, and they analyze them for whether they have any kind of a hypothesis, whether they have a mechanistic hypothesis, and whether they have multiple alternative hypotheses. And this is the graph showing multiple alternative hypotheses in a suite of high-profile journals. And you can see the largest bar there only goes to a proportion of 0.2. So suggesting that we in ecology are pretty poor at articulating multiple alternative hypotheses. The other graphs were a little bit better, but still not great. The overall conclusion of this paper was we do not do a good job addressing hypotheses in our work. And I found this one especially striking because a paper that I always give to students who are doing their comp exam for philosophy of science is this gem. It's just really old, from 1890, but published in Science by T.C. Chamberlain. And it's titled The Method of Multiple Working Hypotheses. So the idea of multiple working hypotheses is not brand new. It's from 2 centuries ago. But we're clearly not very good at it, as shown by Betts and colleagues. So something to think about when we're designing experiments is making sure there's a clear hypothesis, and possibly in complex systems like landscapes, it's valuable to consider multiple working hypotheses. All right, so what are the criteria for a good experiment? This is probably not news to any of you, but one of the most important things, of course, is to have a control. And so this is just a simple little cartoon to emphasize the fact that the control is something that is identical to the experimental unit that you're applying the treatment, except that the treatment is absent. And so it allows you to infer quite strongly that any difference you see between these two experimental units is due to the treatment alone and not to some other unknown factor. You never know that perfectly, of course, but that's the idea and that's the goal. You also, another good criteria for a good experiment is that your treatments are randomized. You don't want to just put all the treatments on the plants growing closest to the window, because then you're not accounting for the confounding effect that the plants growing to the window have other things that might be influencing their growth. And you want to replicate. So when you're doing like a greenhouse experiment, it's easy to have lots of replicates. We get taught in stats, in early stats, replication gives you better statistical power. It avoids, seeing some kind of outlier effect and thinking that's the norm. So control, randomization, replication are the three key things to a good experiment, coupled with good development of hypotheses. So why is this challenging to do in a landscape, which is something I talk about quite a bit in the book, and this is kind of motivated by the fact that retrospective in the journal Landscape Ecology talked about the fact that we don't do a lot of experiments in landscape ecology. So applying those criteria, well, applying a control can be kind of difficult at that extent. If this is our landscape and we want to split it in half and apply a treatment to one side of it and a control to the other, that boundary is difficult to implement as a hard boundary. Other than a few really elegant experiments in the experimental lake series, it's really hard to sort of draw a line and treat one half of a lake uniquely from another half of the lake. There's heterogeneity in that landscape. These two halves of the landscape are not identical. One half has more trees in it, one half has more rocks and bog in it. So it's not the most reliable control. Randomizing, you can see this is the lights, but where do you put your plots so that they're truly random? Because there's underlying patterns here. There's gradients. There's other factors that might make it difficult to have a truly random sample. And then the third issue is, of course, replication. Anybody recognize where this shot is from? Yeah.
I was going to say the Avalon Wilderness Area.
No, it's not Avalon. I thought you might know. It's in Terra Nova. It's Ochre Hill. Yeah, it's Ochre Hill. Anyway, so Ochre Hill in Terra Nova. So if my study site is Terra Nova, I can't replicate and have multiple Terra Novas. There's only one Terra Nova. So my N is one national park. And so that makes it difficult to do sort of traditional statistical analyses in landscape. There's a few other issues unique to landscapes that make it challenging to do experiments. One of these is the issue of scale. Any of you who've had me on your committee or has had me as a comp examiner or been in my courses know, we obsess about scale in landscape ecology. But scale has been articulated by, this is an older paper, but it's sort of foundational to the discipline, by Haggett in 1983, who identified 3 scale problems that make it difficult to do studies in landscapes, or when scale is at play. So the first is called the scale coverage problem, and that's basically describes the fact that the surface of the Earth is too large to map and understand its spatial variability accurately. So this is the kind of fun thing where you zoom in on sections of the planet, and at each level you see different kinds of detail, but you also miss other kinds of information. So there's this trade-off between precision and accuracy as you zoom in on San Francisco, on Golden State Park, and on a pond, and right on a flower in a pond. And all of those are viable extents at which you could do some kind of study, but at each extent you're sacrificing other information and other accuracies. The second problem is the scale linkage problem, and this sort of relates to the fact that field ecology is usually done at the scale of, maybe meters, maybe hundreds of meters, maybe a kilometer or so, but generally at small extents. And it can be difficult to relate those fine scale data to broader spatial scales. Doing that extrapolation is not always completely straightforward, owing to all kinds of other spatial complexities. And then the final one is the scale standardization problem. This is more of a technical problem and more of an issue when you're doing data mining or mapping work, but that's if data are not presented at equivalent scales. It is difficult to compare data from different locations, to extrapolate data from one place to another, or to assemble different data sets from different places, or for different points in time for the same place. The second issue, so I have a whole chapter talking about scale, and that's just the Cold Notes version. The second issue, which is really sort of gnarly one to unpack, is the issue of pseudo-replication, which I'm sure you've encountered this term before. And again, I have a whole chapter talking about it because it's particularly germane to work in landscapes. Pseudo-replication causes a lot of confusion and a lot of grief for people. One of the reasons is that there are different definitions or descriptions of what pseudo-replication is, even in the same paper, or even in papers by the same person who gets cited a lot about pseudo-replication. So one of these is that it's testing for treatment effects with an error term that's inappropriate to the hypothesis being considered. That's a nearly direct quote. The second is it's an experimental design where treatments are spatially or temporally segregated. And the third is making inferences beyond the limits of the experiment. So don't have a ton of time to go into detail on that. I could do an entire lecture on pseudo-replication, but just sort of show you visually what it can look like and why it's particularly an issue for landscape ecology. This is a schematic of a hypothetical study. So what we have here is two pieces of the landscape. One is unlogged, one is logged, and we've got sample points within them, some kind of quadrats. And because we only have, we might think that each of these is a replicate. And so we might think we have a fair bit of replication between our treatment and our control. But in reality, we just have one logged area and one unlogged area. So we really only have one replicate of the treatment and one of the control. And these sampling points are pseudo-replicated. You see accusations, when you have a design like this, you frequently see an accusation of pseudo-replication. Same thing if you have fish in a tank, and these are fish, and this is a control tank, and that's a treatment tank, but you're treating the fish as the replicates, the individual fish. Those would be, in some cases, considered pseudo-replicates. Whereas this example here, where we have sort of checkerboard of treatments and controls interspersed, and a smaller set of sampling points within each, would be not pseudo-replicated. So there are solutions to these problems. And again, I go into a lot more detail in the book. But the first problem where the error term is inappropriate to the hypothesis, that's actually quite solvable with consideration of how you partition the error in your F ratio. I don't have time to go into the details of that, but thinking about where the error is and isolating the error that you're interested in. The second one, the issue of the experimental design, is just thinking about your experimental design carefully and thinking really, considering really carefully what can be treated as a fixed versus a random effect. Because if you treat certain things as random effects, it can help you solve some of those issues of the error term. And then making the inferences beyond the limits of the experiment is just be very transparent about what the limitations are. So in that logging example I showed you, there's nothing wrong with the study of one log landscape and one control landscape, but any inferences from that study are limited to those two plots. They're just limited to that landscape. I can't say anything beyond that about what the effective logging is on that forest type beyond the limits of that study area, which is fine if that's what I want to do, as long as I'm being very transparent. Dave Schneider is an excellent resource. I had numerous really interesting conversations and discussions with him on this topic. He's really passionate about this topic as well. So if you want to learn more, you can also have a chat with him. Okay, so real briefly then, I want to just show you a little taxonomy of types of experiments. So as I said, the retrospective in the journal Landscape Ecology accused landscape ecologists of not being very good at doing experiments. And it's quite true. There are not a lot of papers with explicit experimental focus in landscape ecology, nor have we spent a lot of time thinking about landscape or about experiments, except for this one paper that came out in 2012 by Daryl Jenner and Wayne Shen, which was just a perspectives piece talking about experimental landscape ecology. And the purpose of their paper was to identify what kinds of experiments we could do as landscape ecology. So it's a taxonomy or a classification of experimental types. So they came up with 15 types of experiments. I'm not going to read them all out to you. It's a fairly long list, but they grouped them in 4 broad categories. So the first category is identification of landscape structure. So those are just experiments that help us understand the spatial patterns in the landscape. The second category is location of process variation in landscape. So that's just a weirder way of saying just looking at the ecological processes at play in space. So those could be processes like competition, predation, nutrient flux, energy flux, those kinds of things, movement of organisms, anything that's dynamic, but how is it happening in space? And the third one is linking the pattern to the process. The third category are types of experiments that ask how does the pattern influence the process? And then the fourth one is identifying what factors influence the formation of landscape. So this was a really useful paper in writing my book because it helped me think about the types of experiments, but it didn't talk about how to do them, about the experimental approaches. And so that's the last part of the talk, and that's really the bulk of what the book is about. So what I want to do for this section, these are the 6 experimental approaches I talk about. And so they're large-scale manipulative experiments, experimental model landscapes, mesocosms, microcosms, in silico landscapes, and then last is sort of novel landscapes, some kind of creative ideas. So for each of these, I have 3 slides. Each slide has a slightly different example, different photo, which I'll try to summarize briefly, but I won't have time to go into detail. On the first slide in each of these 6 groups, I've got a list of the types of experiments that could be done from this taxonomy from Jenner and Shen. So different of these approaches are amenable to different types of experiments. And then the next slide talks about some advantages of each of these approaches, and the third slide talks about the disadvantages. So you're getting sort of 6 chapters, 3 slides per chapter. That's why it's the Coles Notes talk. And I'm happy to afterwards, talk about any of them in more depth if you want. So yeah, that's what I just told you. I'm going to do examples, types of experiments. So I'll just indicate that for both taxonomy icon and then advantages and disadvantages. All right, so large-scale manipulations, these are usually the things we think of when we think of landscape experiments. So this is a map of the Biological Dynamics of Forest Fragmentations project in Brazil. And so this is a project that's taking advantage of ongoing forest harvest activities, but applying some of it in an experimental fashion. So if you look closely, you can see some blocks that are fairly regular and of different sizes that are repeated across the landscape. And those are deliberately designed in an experimental fashion to address how fragmentation affects a whole host of ecological processes. So this is an example of in situ experiments. They have done translocation experiments in this landscape where they move organisms from one type of patch to another. And then obviously the main focus is experiments related to patch shape, connectivity, and fragmentation. This is a similar experiment on fragmentation from the Savannah River experiment in South Carolina, where they're also looking at fragmentation effects and looking at patch shape and size. So this is a little different from the BDFFP because here the patches, the experimentation is actually removal of trees rather than leaving remnant trees. But I don't know how well you can see it with the light, but basically they have rectangular fragments, then they have fragments that sort of are shaped like a plus sign that are the same size as these in terms of area, but they have more higher edge ratio, and then they have some fragments that are connected. And so they're looking at how, and then these are replicated across the system. So advantages of these types of experiments, these large-scale manipulations, are that they're quite realistic because they're happening in situ, all the sort of natural background ecological processes are ongoing. And they can translate well to policy and management. So as with the BDFFP, they're working closely with resource managers, and so it can inform things like dictating how large clear cuts can be without having adverse effects, or dictating patterns of clear cuts to minimize disturbance for species of interest. This is another one from Australia. Again, this one was done in cooperation with some plantation work that was going on. And again, these are fragments that are deliberately set to be different sizes. So these things can be expensive because they're at kilometer extents and you're talking about, cutting down trees. So they're often done, that's partly the reason they're done in cooperation with resource activities, because the extraction has value. It can take a long time to see results. So depending on the organism you're focusing on. Sometimes the effects you see a year or two after the fragmentation or after the manipulation don't reflect what you might see 10 or 15 or 20 years later. And some of these have been ongoing for decades, these experiments, so we know that the sort of effects change through time. And there's a risk of environmental disturbance. So if a wildfire rips through or a windstorm or something, your whole experiment can get trashed quite quickly. That's a disadvantage. All right, the second type of experimental approach I want to talk about then is what I call experimental model landscapes. And again, this sort of matches what a lot of people think of when they think of a landscape experiment, but they're a little different from the previous category. This one I call the poster child for landscape experiments. This is by Kimberly Whip at Bowling Green. And this is a 4-hectare farm field. The dark green are patches of clover, and the yellow is bare soil, and then around it is just some I think it's just Kentucky bluegrass, just to keep the patches isolated from each other. And this was a very elegantly designed experiment to look at the dual effects of habitat amount and fragmentation, but controlling for habitat amount on arthropods. So these patterns were designed as random landscapes through a computer model, and then recreated at these extents by carefully planting clover, and then going in, the grad students and the technicians had to go in and like hand weed frequently to keep these patterns intact, and then they caught grasshoppers and they looked at the effect of grasshoppers on these patterns. So as with the large-scale manipulations, the things you can do here are related to patch shape and connectivity and fragmentation. Those are the main types of experiments we see in these model landscapes. This is another one. This is the Kansas University fragmentation experiment in Ohio. So you notice a lot of these are in the Midwest, where universities have a fair bit of land and they can afford to set it aside for these experiments. And this is a similar kind of field-based experiment where there's plots that are cleared of different numbers of plots and different sizes of plots, and they're looking at the effects of fragmentation and also interplot distance. So these are fairly realistic. Again, they're occurring in situ, but they're in a little bit more of a simplified landscape because they're in an agricultural landscape as opposed to the previous set, which were in forested landscapes. But you have also more control over multiple treatments. So you can control different things like amount, like interpatch distance, like shape, like degree of fragmentation, so that you can do quite elegant experiments. Some disadvantages is they can be logistically challenging. As I mentioned, they have to send technicians out to weed every couple of weeks to keep the pattern intact. There's also sometimes a lot of work to do in terms of mowing, or sometimes herbicide applications are necessary to keep plants from growing where you don't want them. And again, they can be pretty subject to human interferences. A lot of these happen on university campuses. And so, in some cases, in Kim With's experiment, they had to erect a big fence around it at some expense just to keep people from walking in and trashing it and interfering with the experiment. All right, so then moving on to a smaller scale, I want to talk a little bit about the third experimental approach that I think landscape ecologists could do a better job taking advantage of, and that's mesocosms. So mesocosms have been used forever in community ecology and ecosystem ecology, but as I dug around in the literature on mesocosms, I found quite a few examples of papers that maybe didn't set out to be landscape ecology questions, but were spatially explicit in one way or in another. And particularly, they were amenable to some of the experimental types that Jenner and Chen identified around in situ experiments, translocations, and in some cases, patch connectivity. So this is a soil permafrost mesocosm that has this plexiglass container with a barrier in front of it or between it, and they put soil on one side, and they put different sort of levels of permafrost, and there's different levels of porosity to look at the connectivity for different kinds of soil organisms moving between them, and then they put these in situ in different places along a gradient. So there's a spatial dimension to how they place the mesocosms. So these things have advantages in that there's a high degree of experimental control because you've got these containers that are almost like mini little labs where you control exactly what goes in the container and how the container gets manipulated. There's possibility for a high amount of replication. So you can put lots of these mesocosms out there to have lots of replication, particularly if your mesocosm is an inexpensive type of container. And that's the other advantage. They can be inexpensive. A lot of these just use things like kiddie pools or rubberized totes, not very expensive items. And so there's a lot of advantages to using mesocosms. Some disadvantages are because most of them are occurring are small. Scaling up can be challenging. They can be less realistic in some cases because in most mesocosms, the experimenter is controlling what goes in the container. And so if they're omitting something critical, some kind of critical microorganism or critical process, then the ability to extrapolate to the real world becomes limited. They can be expensive, so things like ecotrons are mesocosm experiments at large extents, but are very expensive to run and maintain. And as I mentioned, it's a little harder to make them spatially explicit, and they haven't traditionally been applied for spatial questions, but I think there's a lot of potential for that. Related to that is the fourth category of experimental approaches is microcosms. And the thing that differentiates a mesocosm from a microcosm is a mesocosm is a container experiment where the container is artificial, and a microcosm is a container experiment where the container is something natural. So any experiment inside of a pitcher plant is a microcosm. The pitcher plant itself is a microcosm, and we could do manipulations on a bunch of pitcher plants in a bog, and that would be a microcosm experiment. And as with the mesocosms, there's loads of examples of microcosm experiments in community and ecosystem ecology, less so in landscape ecology, but I think, again, there's potential, particularly for experiments around tracer experiments, looking at quality of internal patch characteristics. And I did find some microcosm experiments on patch connectivity and fragmentation as well. So this is a moss microcosm from Andy Gonzalez. So this is a manipulated microcosm. These are patches of moss that got neatly cut out in a kind of cookie cutter experiment. So this echoes some of those large scale landscape manipulations. It's explicitly looking at things like fragmentation and patch size dynamics, but at a micro scale. And so you can have replicate rocks with these cutouts of moss, and you have more statistical power than you do in a single sort of kilometers extent landscape. So some advantages of microcosms is they might be more realistic than mesocosms because it's a system that occurs naturally and is sort of functioning in situ in its natural way. As I mentioned already, there's possibility for high amount of replication. Think about how many pitcher plants you walk across when you walk across any given bog in Newfoundland. That's a high end. And they can function also as model systems. So this would be an example of sort of a model system of a larger kind of island manipulation. Tank bromeliads are another kind of microcosm that's commonly used in a lot of ecology studies. So these have a little tank kind of inside them which has its own sort of little ecosystem and is home habitat for a lot of smaller organisms and are also easily manipulated. So disadvantage of these systems, as with the mesocosms, there's a scaling issue. How much can you extrapolate from these small scale systems to understand larger scale systems? A little more difficult to make these spatially explicit because you don't pick them up and move them around the way you do your mesocosms. And they're, again, risk of environmental disturbances because they're in situ. All right. Then the second to last example is what are called in silico landscapes. So these are landscapes inside of a computer. They basically, it's a funky way of just saying computer modeling, but landscape ecologists do and have done a lot of this. Right from the earliest days of the journal, you can find papers in the papers that have something to do with some kind of computer modeling. And so you can do pretty much every kind of experiment in Jenner and Shen's taxonomy, except for in situ and ex situ experiments. You can do them in a landscape. If you can imagine it and you can program it, you can do an experiment. And the sort of types of computer models vary. They can be agent-based models, they can be cellular automata models, they can be different kinds of simulation, they can incorporate population models different kinds of statistical models. The sky's the limit, really, in terms of the types of computer models that get used in landscape ecology. So the advantage of working in an in silico landscape are when you have full control of all the variables, right? You're just programming it, so you can control exactly how things happen in that model. You can have many, many permutations. If you have, your computer allows it, those are your treatments. You can tweak it as many different ways as you want, and you can replicate it pretty easily. Pretty easy to get lots of reps in a computer model. Disadvantages, there can be scale complexity trade-offs. So if you're doing a spatial model using, say, GIS data, GIS data comes with pixels is the finest resolution, but each pixel represents 8 bits of data. So if you have a very large landscape, your computer may kind of start to slow down at a certain point, or just may become too computationally intense. So you might have to sacrifice some of the complexity to go to a bigger scale. Computing limitations can be an issue, but those are becoming less and less of a concern than even 5 or 10 years ago with cloud computing. And sometimes it can be difficult to, figure out how to parameterize your model. You need to get your parameters from somewhere. And if you don't have, with all of these types of models, the GIGO, garbage in, garbage out acronym applies. And so if your models are poorly parameterized, they're actually not that useful. But they're very useful for visualization. So this is a future landscape model. This is a computer software that models future landscape scenarios. So it takes a current landscape, a real world landscape, and it sort of projects out under different sort of policy scenarios. And then it maps it out. And nowadays it can even attach that to virtual reality. And basically they can show that to decision makers, they can show that to community members, and people can see, well, what would, the Northeast Avalon look like if we suddenly, change the policy to say, no more big box stores, or, we're going to put limits on any new cars on the road, or we're going to improve public transit, or we're going to change housing density rules. You can tell the computer how to, use those rules to develop the landscape 50, 100, 200 years into the future, and then you can map it. People generally like maps, and you can even make, sort of fly-through simulations that people can explore, and then that can help inform making of decisions. All right, last category. I don't have the same format of the previous 5 chapters, but I just wanted to introduce a few ideas of other landscapes that are out there that are amenable to experiments and that also might be amenable to landscape experiments. So the first are seascapes. So given we're at Memorial and we have lots of colleagues working in marine environment, this is a logical one to explore. But I would argue that seascapes have all of the same characteristics as landscapes. Certainly the benthic environment has topology and land cover, but even the water column has patches. They're just much more dynamic than in a terrestrial system, but you have plankton patches, you have fronts, you have eddies, you have chlorophyll, you have thermoclines. Those are patches that organisms are responding to. It's just happening at a much faster pace than in a terrestrial landscape. But I think there's lots of cool experiments in ocean systems. Some of them are strictly on the benthos, and so then they're much more analogous to terrestrial experiments. But even in the sort of 3D ocean, I think there might be some opportunities for landscape ecologists to explore this as a way to do different kinds of experiments. The other sort of novel landscape that landscape ecologists are just starting to explore is that of soundscapes. And this is an interesting sort of area of research that melds acoustic ecology, behavioral ecology, and landscape ecology. And you can be focused on different dimensions of sound in space. So that sound can be biotic, which is indicated by the green bubbles here. It can be geologic in origin, which is called geophony, or it can be amphiphony, which is the human sounds. And these are experiments that ask, well, how does the pattern of the landscape influence the transmission of sound? How does it influence the way organisms respond to sound? And so while most sort of acoustic experiments are grounded mainly in behavioral ecology, not necessarily thinking about that landscape scale, I think there's room to sort of merge with those folks and think about some spatially explicit questions and maybe help address some landscape ecology issues at the same time. And then those of you who were here when Joel Brown was the BGSS speaker will remember him talking about ecology and evolution of cancer. And Joel and his group argue that we can think of cancer tumors as landscapes. They have heterogeneity, they have gradients, they have patches. And so we can think about working with these landscapes. So I'm calling them sort of corporeal landscapes. And from the folks at Moffitt, where Joel works, it's informing cancer treatment, which is obviously really important. But from a landscape ecologist perspective, this could be a really great way to do some experiments, because you go to any research hospital and they'll have drawers and drawers full of histological slides of different people's tumors, and they'll have all the information about that person's history. So you have replication like up the wazoo. So it's kind of an interesting area for further research and a sort of very cross-disciplinary collaboration. And then these are from a paper, a 2017 paper I found in an ear, nose, and throat journal that was talking all about the landscape of the ear, nose, and throat. And it was writing to medical folks and arguing that taking a more of a landscape ecology lens to things like the spatial complexity of your mouth might be informative to things like medical treatments. And so again, maybe that's a venue for ecological research for folks like me. So that's kind of just another novel landscape. So to summarize, experiments are challenging, but not impossible to do in landscapes. Landscape experiments can address many different types of questions, as I showed you with the taxonomy. They use many different approaches. I sort of outlined 6 different approaches for you here in this talk. But you need to have careful thought to your experimental design. Definitely don't neglect your hypotheses, and it helps to be really, really creative in your experiment. So my final message is, don't forget to ask why. I always am bugging my students about this. Why is that an interesting question? Why do you think, X influences Y? Why are you sampling it that way? Always have that question at the forefront when you're doing experiments. And just like to thank all these folks who helped me get to this point. And with that, I'm happy to take any questions.
Excellent, thanks, Yolanda. So yeah, we'll do questions, and if anyone has a question online, you can just enter it in the chat, and we'll read it out loud, and
Okay.
we'll be able to answer it if that's cool.
Yep, that's cool. Okay, so questions go in the chat. And are you monitoring that? Okay, cool.
Great. So,
All right, let's go for the room first, then Adam.
Great, yeah, thanks so much for the talk. I'm curious, so I find the contributions or potential contributions of landscape ecology to other disciplines totally fascinating, and just in general ecology's contribution to other disciplines. Do you think is landscape ecology fundamentally a two-dimensional approach, and do you think there needs to be development of tools and ways of thinking to move into three-dimensional problems, or do you think the tools are already there, you can hop right in?
Yeah, no, you mean in terms of when you say two-dimensional, you mean our analyses, we're doing two-dimensional analysis in two-dimensional space?
Yeah, two-dimensional analyses, or just two-dimensional approaches, either theoretical or experimental.
Yeah, no, I would say there's a lot of examples of multi-dimensional studies already out there, both in terms of conceptually and just in terms of tools applied. So I think it's there.
Cool.
It's maybe not super widespread, but it's up there.
Mm-hmm. Cool.
Great.
So not a question, but a comment, just particularly for grad students who are listening. If anybody is interested in that topic, the grad course that I teach those springs is about 50% overlap with that. It's basically the differences between field monitoring and field experiments, focusing on confounding variables and pseudo replication. So yeah, but 50% of that course would fit directly under all that model.
I have a new textbook for your course.
The name of the course is Field Sampling Approaches and Applied Statistical Philosophy.
Cool. Levi.
I
Actually, a question about the landscape modeling.
Yeah.
That was really interesting. I'm thinking about like influencing management decisions. Like I guess that would be a good tool to like if you can give someone a video flyover or something like that.
Yeah.
Like I imagine it's like it's really interactive and like easy for anyone to like understand what you're doing. But how, like on the other hand, like folks know that you're not actually like doing a physical experimental landscape. So how does like is there some kind of trade-off there in like?
Yeah, well, like as you know, the aphorism goes, all models are wrong, but some are useful. So with those kind of futures modeling, often they're coupled with the best ones, and I highlight some of them in that chapter, are coupled with field-based experiments. So they'll do a smaller extent field experiment that they'll then use to parameterize the model. So they'll say, okay, we know if, like let's take a forestry example. So we know from some of these field experiments I showed you, if we harvest forests this way, this is the effect it has on songbirds. And it ends up looking like this. So then we can build that at a larger extent, say, to a model and do a larger landscape and say, okay, well, if we change our forest policy to say, okay, your limits on your cut block size are X, this is what the landscape will look like, this is how many birds will be on it, versus if we go to less conservative model, this is what our landscape will look like. So it's with any of those models, it's how you build those rules. So a lot of the future landscape modeling is tied in with urban ecology, which is really cool. So a lot of it is tied to urban policy. So they sort of already know, well, if you make this kind of policy decision, these are the sort of trickle down effects. And so it gives it that level of realism, but you can do, if there's an urban area that's engaging in, maybe rapidly growing and engaging in some planning, they can look to other urban areas to develop a model for their system that also takes into account, their own local topography, their own local hydrology, their own local soils, but they can then inform it and they can say, okay, if we create, if this becomes the policy applied, this is what the landscape will look like. If we go this way, this is what it looks like. And then you have that. Then you build that, it runs, and then you get these either maps or these flyover landscapes, or sometimes even these VR landscapes that you can actually walk through with your VR goggles on. It's really cool.
It's very
Yeah.
There's a question on Zoom from Kay and Taya. And they ask, going back to the topic of control sites in landscape ecology, can a landscape be its own control? For example, in a study on habitat fragmentation and roads, where road mortality surveys were conducted before mitigation activities were carried out, would this be considered the control?
That's a good question. Yeah. So what you're getting at there is like a before-after experiment. And you do see papers that would argue that the before is the control, and then something happens, like a road goes in, and that's the after. And in some cases that can suffice, but the better approach is a full-on backing. So before after control impact study. And there's been a number of papers recently, and I talk about them in the book, where they've taken really elegant backing studies. There's actually a big meta-analysis paper that came out about a year ago, and then took the results of those studies and looked at what the interpretation would be if they had only done a before-after study or just a control impact study. And in a lot of cases, the answer changes. So the before-after, the problem with doing that is time marches on, and you don't know for sure if the changes you're seeing are due to just changes that would have happened through time anyway, or are they due to the impact? So it's sort of what, yeah, can landscapes be their own control? Yes and no. They're not perfect. Yeah, they're imperfect controls. It's a good question though. What else?
Another question. So how do we reconcile our subjective interpretation of landscape heterogeneity, which tends to emphasize structure and composition, and true in situ ecological heterogeneity, which may be resolved by different ecological variables and points of spatial discontinuity?
Oh, wow. Okay, I can't repeat that question. I hope everybody else in Zoom can hear you reading the questions. Or well, I guess they can see them too. Oh gosh. How do we deal with our own? I guess I'll try to answer the first part of the question first. So we have all kinds of metrics out there for measuring landscape pattern, and I suppose on a certain level those might be fallible to human subjectivity, but not necessarily. Sometimes they're driven by the data themselves, and so then I would argue that maybe they're a little less infallible. The perception experiments, which was one of the experimental types Generation came up with, is often based on looking at the landscape from the perspective of your organism of interest. And so those are experiments where you follow an animal through its life, whether that's, with a GPS collar, like the work that, folks in Eric's lab do, or that's just, marking the where a beetle moves with toothpicks and then looking at what the landscape looks like. Those would be then, I think, ways that you kind of can start to see and quantify the landscape without your human biases, because you're sort of interpreting it through the eyes of the organism. So I don't know if that answers. I don't think I've answered all of that question. That's a long question. Go back and actually read it. Any other questions?
All right. Well, that's it then. Thank you again, Yolanda, for the excellent presentation.
Awesome.
Is it like an online?
Oh, it's coming out in both hard copy and online. Springer does this thing where they, because we have the library has a Springer subscription, you should be able to download individual chapters through QE2, but otherwise you can either buy the whole book in hard copy or you can buy individual chapters from Springer if you don't have library access.
Hard copy.
So you'll know when it's out. I'll let people know.
Yeah, congrats on the book.
Yeah.
Thank you. Well, don't congratulate. Don't say anything till it's out.
You that corporeal landscape thing is that's super cool. I'm not you can find landscape culture, don't say anything, I guess.
I'm just going to stop
I guess
recording.